So now I want to talk about the history, how history came in to create this astrological system in the East and the West. So if you do a chart for 200 AD, so around the time 2,000 years ago, around the time of Christ, we know that that was a time when there was a lot of unification of society. It started with the conquest of Alexander the Great in 300, a little before 300 BC, and that conquest included the Middle East, Egypt, certainly Greece, and then all the way to India. So Alexander the Great was conquering all these regions, and under the Greek Empire, these areas started to become unified. Their knowledge started being exchanged. And then the Roman Empire expanded on this. So Roman Empire extended the communication all the way from Rome to England, and then of course Egypt, the Middle East, Sumeria, and then all the way to India. And we know that the Roman emperors had communication with India, because probably trade as well, because they used astrologers from India to make decisions. And we know this, for example, for Emperor Claudius of Rome, that he used an Eastern astrologer, a Vedic astrologer. Also, we know from some of the writings that the Yavana people, Yavana was the term given by the Vedic culture in India to the people who lived in Greece. So the Yavanas went to India to study astrology, and there was a communication between them. And one of the great books of astrology is by a gentleman called Yavana Ishwara, or Yavaneshwar. It's a classic of Vedic astrology, and he was a Yavana, a Greek. So at that time, the communication and knowledge between Sumeria, Egypt, India, and Greece, Rome, all the knowledge started to, there was a communication. And if you do a chart for 200 AD, you'll find out also that in this picture that I showed you, at springtime, the sun was lined up with Aries, and Mars was in the sign of Aries. So at the spring equinox on 200 AD, you can do a chart, you can see that. You can start seeing that. Then the next month, next 30-day interval, you see the sun was in Taurus and Venus was in Taurus. And then the next month, the sun was in Gemini, it's lined up with Gemini constellation, and Mercury was in there. So from that, you can see that the meaning of these markers, these constellation markers, was established about 2,000 years ago, because that was the picture of the heavens at that time. And if you think about it, I mean, people are not thinking what's going to happen 2,100 years from now or 2,000 years from now. They're thinking, well, that's the way the heavens are, and that's good enough for me. So the sun, in spring, the sun is in Aries, and the next, and the next, and the next, and this is how it is. And the planets ruling those months, you know, the Aries, that's Mars, and then Taurus, that's Venus, that's the lordship of the planet lording that's how it came to be, and it's kind of going to be like that, at least within our lifetime, and we're not thinking 2,000 years from now. And of course, Roman Empire came and went. So the zodiac positions for these 1 to 12 sectors of the heavens and their energetics, it became formalized in the books of that time. So the meaning of Aries And because Aries, there was Mars energy, and it was kind of very creative time, they associated with Mars. And then Taurus, from the 6,000 years previous, they said that's a plowing time. And so you have, Earth and so on. And during the time of certain seasons, you had these Adityas. This is in the Vedic text also. They started with Aries, which pinpoints that was the time they formalized a lot of the Vedic text, because there was this cultural exchange. And the Puranas, they talk about the season starting with Aries at the equinox, and that's the time of Datar, the giver of life, and there's a lot of Mars energy, fire energy. And then during another time, it's the period of Varuna, in the peak of summer there. That's a time of water. So that was the time of Cancer, during Cancer constellation, the crab. So the number 4 position. And when you start the summer, so it rains a lot, water. Varuna means the quality of the sun is called Varuna Aditya, which means a lot of water, a lot of rain. And then in the middle of Capricorn, this became the number 10 position. In winter, it became that first month of winter that was associated with congealing energy. When you congeal, when it's cold, ice, water congeals, that's associated with earth element, congealing. So you had these 4 qualities of, and then I didn't mention, but that 6,000 years ago, when you had Aquarius was in that position. Remember I said Taurus was here, Sun, Leo was here, Scorpio was here, and then Aquarius was here 6,000 years ago. This is before they formalized everything. Aquarius, during that peak of winter, they also said it was windy time, so a lot of wind, so it was associated with airy. I got some hints from looking at Ptolemy. He describes it. He talks about it. A certain season is windy, a certain month is rainy, and that's how you get these water signs. Fire, it's hot, fire sign, and earth sign. And so they were trying to link it up with their observations, and then it stuck. The name of the constellation present at that time became the label for that particular sector of the sky, that particular time of the year, that month. And it all makes sense. It's kind of logical. So that was formalized, as I say, about 200 AD. The book of Ptolemy lived around, I think, 180 AD. So when he wrote his book Tetrabiblos, where he describes the meaning of some of these things, he talked about why, you've got an air sign, water sign. So he talks a little bit about it. He gives hints about it. So putting the two together, the Vedic names for each month, dealing with water and fire and all that, and beginning of life, and then looking at Ptolemy's explanation, that helps to understand how this was developed. If you look at the Eastern texts, which I've read through, many of them, you see that they mostly are functionally, they're mostly action-oriented. If the sun is here, it produces this effect. If Mars is here, it produces this effect, and so on and so forth. And that was according to the sky as it was 2,000 years ago. When Mars is here, that's the conclusion. They don't go into explaining why. Why does it do that? So Ptolemy does a little bit. The Greeks were more, Socratic method. They were thinking about questioning and trying to understand the science behind it. In the East, I think they were very brilliant. They obviously, from their books, they developed the number 0. They calculated correctly even the distance of Earth to Sun. There's even evidence that they calculated the speed of light. They had high culture, high civilization of some sort. in ancient times, the people who were the most ancient, who developed things. However, uh, I think they took for granted, assuming that certain things were that way because it was obvious. So they didn't explain it very much. So now we come to an interesting point about the development of astrology West and East. So unknown to me, because I'm still learning. Everything is still developing. The knowledge about these ancient cultures and how they put things together and how it applies to modern times and what elements we can take from the description of things to further our own science and understanding of life. That's still going on, being perfected. So we have to look what happened west and east, knowing that the markers, the constellations, will keep changing. The number one position here nowadays, now at this particular century, the number one position is occupied by the constellation Pisces. So Pisces becomes the Aries of 2,000 years ago and has all the qualities of Aries, because it's really this position, the energetics of this position, that is the reference frame. This is really the reference frame. It's kind of like for astrology, it's kind of like yourself. You are the center point. If you're not there, then nothing else makes sense. There's just a lot of experience. So for you to be established there, that's your reference point. And you measure everything according to where you are, your own consciousness. So if you don't have this energetics there, then you could say, well, the sun is really strong when it's here. As the constellations keep rotating, eventually the sun will be here. And if you just go by the constellations, so, well, the sun is really strong here. No, it's the weakest point of the zodiac as far as if you're above the equator. I mean, it's the weakest point of the zodiac, so you can't say it's strong. You can't say it's a fire sign or anything. It will have no meaning. So we have to keep the reference point. So this is where the East and the West started diverging in their understanding or maintenance of this proper reference point so that the whole field makes sense and is scientific. So in the West, unknown to me, there were many people who were interested in astrology, and it included the early church fathers like Clement and Origen, Clement of Alexandria, I think, Origen, and then later on we had people like Copernicus and Galileo and Tycho Brahe and Sir Francis Bacon, Sir Isaac Newton, and so on. Many very fine minds that appreciated the astrology of things. And they, from the earlier work of Hipparchus and others, they realized that the constellations keep changing in the sky. So the markers will keep changing. However, the labels for the meaning of these 12 sectors that I showed you, the fact this is called Aries, Taurus, and so on, those labels that came to be associated with certain qualities, those are pretty well developed. So the labels, we're using the same labels, but everything rotates so that now Pisces is here, for example, and it's not really Aries anymore, but we have a label there, Aries meaning this sector. So what to do? So realizing this is the situation, they artificially just rotated. They added the same number of degrees to everything. So they just rotated everything back. They just rotated everything back so we could say this is Aries. So if whatever positions, if this is Pisces, we just rotated back to that position so that we maintain the framework, the reference point of these equinox and solstice points. And so that way we can preserve the true meaning of what it means. We'll just rotate it, we'll make a calculation. So over the centuries, because everything deviates a certain number of degrees per century. They kept adding degrees to rotate it, so we can always call this time period, this sector, wherever that the planets are in the start, we keep it at, we can call it Aries. And that way we have proper energetics. And now, after all these centuries, they have to rotate the whole framework, the circle. It's like a merry-go-round. You've got all the players, all the people who play on the merry-go-round. They're seated at certain positions, and the relationships of each other is maintained. It's just that you rotate the wheels so that it lines up with the lake over there, the forest over there, etc., etc., the sandbox over there. And so then you maintain the proper energetics so that you can kind of see how the whole thing is in terms of the whole park. Okay. So that's what the Westerners did. The Western scientists, they added a few degrees. Now it's 24 degrees that they have to add to rotate everything so it fits in this 4 points of nature, the Kalapurusha, the proper Kalapurusha chart. Originally, when I started doing Vedic astrology 29 years ago, almost 30 years ago, I thought, oh, well, Western astrology is not correct because you're calling this Aries, but it's no longer Aries constellation. I was going by the constellations, not understanding fully the implication of what was being done. And even though I thought I understood it, now I really appreciate it more and see what was done. So this became what's called the tropical zodiac, the Western zodiac, based on these points of nature. And looking at the Vedic texts, I had confirmation that this indeed is the way the most ancient astrology was based on. 2,000 years ago, when everything was formalized in India and Egypt and Greece and Sumeria, they were all connected in their civilization, and they formalized this thing. At that time, there was no conflict between East or West. It was the same astrology. And indeed, when we look at Western astrology, all of Western astrology, all these principles of the signs and the elements of the sign, the fire, water, the cardinal, movable, versus fixed, all these things were identical. There was no deviation. Progressions, how things were calculated, transits of one planet to another, everything made sense within the context of the framework as it was 2,000 years ago. Now in the East, in Asia, Southeast Asia particularly, there's this idea of tradition, and that what your teacher tells you is sacred, the books are sacred, they're basically absolute. So if the book says that spring starts when the sun is in Capricorn, that is a given fact. You don't question it. Because that's in the astrology books. The only problem is those astrology books were formulated 2,000 years ago when it made sense to call, that spring was in Aries, when the sun was in Aries. So technically all the ceremonies for spring, the yagyas, all the ideas of spring starting, the energetics, the most powerful time to do things, the day of lasting achievements, what's called Victory Day, the day when the sun is in number 1 position, basically. It's here at the equinox, and then the moon is over here above it. On that day, when the sun is the most creative in the beginning of spring, that's the best day to start things, because you're making use of the energies of nature. It makes sense, except they take it literally, and they say when the sun is in Aries. Now, as I mentioned, over time, the sun right now is in Pisces in the number 1 position. So for the sun to be in this most creative time of the equinox of spring when energies are shifting, and for you to partake of those energies, the sun has to be here, not here. So they take it literally. So when the sun is in a fixed place, not when the energies are most creative, that's when the birds nest and it's kind of like together. It's not the creative time of fertility of spring and so on. That is now in the East celebrated as Victory Day, the beginning of spring. So basically, spring is celebrated 1 month later. Now this has implications for alignment, for the energetics of things. So if I tell you the best time to be creative and start a new business or to start some new activity is when we have astrologically the time of the equinox is beginning of spring, when you're lined up with energies, that's a good thing. Okay, so we have that. But if I tell you that the best time to do it is when the sun is in Aries, and that is the best day to do it because that's the beginning of spring and you're lining up with the energies. But we're talking about the middle of spring, not the beginning of spring, when the energies are more stable and fixed. That is not necessarily the best time to start something. So if this process continues, where over the centuries this will deviate more and more, and over thousands of years it will deviate more and more, we'll start to celebrate the beginning of the new energies and the beginning of spring in the middle of winter or some other season. So that's not what the sages intended. And all it needs is a small correction. The same with Uttarayana. Uttarayana in the Vedic text is the time when the sun is the lowest below the equator, and it's about to start moving up towards the equator. And that's the second half of the beginning of the second half of the year as you get towards spring and summer and going to the highest point. So that is normally taking place in December 20th or 21st. However, taking literally that Uttarayana starts when the sun is in Capricorn, and as it was 2,000 years ago, means that right now in Southeast Asia, it's being celebrated. Well, it's not being celebrated during December, it's being celebrated almost 1 month later. Just like spring is, instead of being celebrated at the equinox on March 21st, it's being celebrated 1 month later. And that discrepancy will keep on creeping up. And since a thought just hit me that, well, since in Southeast Asia and India particularly, everything is based on the astrology. Marriages are compatibilities are based on it. Business decisions, actions are based on astrology. But it's the astrology of 2,000 years ago that's referenced instead of making the adjustment to make sure that it lines up with this grid, with the true Kalapurusha. And it's interesting to me that about the time this discrepancy became more major, the last so many hundreds of years, and it started deviating more and more and more, that's a time when, for some reason, India started its civilization going from the wealthiest, most successful, largest. Hindustan used to extend all the way into Cambodia and the rest of Asia, quite a bit of that South Asia, Eastern Asia, and then it extended all the way to the Middle East. It was a huge empire and was wealthy beyond wealth and successful. That high Vedic civilization suddenly kind of started to go down, 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 was conquered, and it became poorer and poorer and poorer about the time the astrology started deviating more and more and more from the way nature was functioning, truly, And I can't help but think that maybe the astrology being increasingly off, the decisions based on it would not be 100%. Now, of course, people that are intuitive, that are looking at planets relative to each other, the energetics of things, um, obviously they're going to tune in maybe to uh, some accuracy about energies moving this way, and they can give a good reading, nevertheless, in spite of this error. But it won't be exactly bullseye. There's going to be some deviation. And so what I would like to see happen is that people understand this principle of Kalapurusha and bring back the accuracy so that both systems align. In Western astrology, it's like a working model. It's like a pocketbook version. All of Western astrology fits in a number of chapters of the volumes of, say, Parashara, the great sage of modern astrology, of Vedic times. And there are many more techniques that are used in Vedic astrology that could be incorporated in Western, and all it takes is just adjust, and it's the same knowledge, same system, same meanings, everything, progressions, transits, everything. It just has to be brought together and understood that it's not different. It's like recognized. It's all the same. It just needs to be unified once you understand what it's based on.